Can do that because we have a full morning and I want to do my best to keep us on schedule as much as possible. Good morning. So this morning we have the pleasure of hearing the Rian Lecture. The Reverend Dr. Edwin H. Rian graduated in the class of 1927 from Princeton Theological Seminary. And the lecture is born out of affection and respect for someone for their institution and also for someone's children for their father. So the fund was set up by the daughters of Edwin H. Rian, one of whom is Abigail Rian Evans, who some of you may have had as a professor here at Princeton Seminary. And Abigail was sorry she can't be with us today. She's traveling. She's on some really cool trip somewhere. So she joined us last year, but she's not with us today. So the Reverend Dr. Edwin H. Rian was ordained a Presbyterian minister in 1930, and his career largely was in theological education. And in 1967, he returned to his alma mater and became secretary to then President James I. McCord. And he retired from that position 15 years later. Dr. Rian's daughter, as I said, was called to our faculty in 1991. So our 90s grads are going to know Abigail. And the interesting thing about this fund is it specifies that it is a lecture to be given at annual reunion. So it is specifically for the alumni and the continuing education of Princeton Theological Seminary's alumni. So it felt fitting that I invite two of our own alumni to give the lecture today. And so we have two people. One, unfortunately, tried very hard to actually get here to do this in person, Andy Root, but he couldn't figure out the schedule. Together, we finally decided it was better to be assured that he could be with us on Zoom rather than stuck in traffic between the airport and here. And now that it's raining today, I'm really glad we decided to do it this way. So with us in person, we have Blair Bertrand. Blair is an MDiv MACEF grad of 2004 from Princeton Theological Seminary. And he's a double and PhD in 2014. He is senior lecturer at Zambia Theological University in Zambia, Malawi. He's ordained in the Presbyterian Church in Canada, and he has served congregations as minister and as an associate for children, youth, and family. His teaching covers a wide range of subjects within practical and systematic theology, including Kwame Bediako, pretty good, the doctrine of Scripture, theological resources in times of grief, youth ministry, and writing theological English. Now, if you hear the years then that Andy was here, you'll understand when the friendship began. And Andrew Root earned his PhD here at Princeton Theological Seminary and graduated in 2006. So he was a doctoral student when Blair was a master's student. He is the Carrie Olson Baleson Professor of Youth and Family Ministry at Luther Seminary. He's most recently the author of a 4-volume Ministry in a Secular Age series where Andy engages Charles Taylor's articulation of our cultural context and the challenge he raises for Christian life in the Western world. The friendship that began as students here at Princeton Seminary has continued, and together they have recently co-authored the book, When Church Stops Working, A Future for Your Congregation Beyond More Money, Programs, and Innovation. And it is this work that I've asked them to touch on this morning in their lecture. So please welcome both Blair in person and Andy on the screen will join us.
This is awesome. Andy's over my left-hand shoulder the whole time. As Dale said, my day job is to teach in a small country in Central Africa named Malawi. I lived there for a while until COVID, and then had to come back, and I continue to go back and forth between those two places. I live in Ottawa, and there are a couple of phrases that I've learned or come to know deeply in Malawi. The first is, we do not take it for granted. And so all of their prayers, all of my colleagues' prayers, and almost always start with, God, we do not take it for granted that we woke up this morning, that we have food to eat, so there's this sense in which there's a deep gratitude towards God and God's provision. And the other one is all protocols observed. It's a relatively hierarchical society, and so you need to make sure that you are saying thank you to the people who are more important than you in a place. And this can go on for a long period of time. Today it will not go for a long period of time. But I do want to acknowledge and thank Dale for the invitation to be here, to speak, and to be able to share some of our work, and also to acknowledge Kenda's presence. The book is dedicated to Kenda, and I speak for both Andy and I that we would not be here if it wasn't for Kenda. And so we are quite happy that she's here and able to participate today. There is also, I'm thankful to Abigail Evans Ryan. I did take a class from Abigail, Dr. Ryan, and part of our book talks about confession, so here we go. I did not take that because I wanted to take the class. I took that because I thought it was going to be a bird class. Because really, in the same semester, I was taking Bruce McCormick's Doctrine of Election. And I thought, he's going to work me, and I don't want to have to work. So I'm going to take this other pastoral care class, which is just going to be a breeze. So friends, you are pastors, you know it was not a breeze. It was around addiction and pastoral care. And in the long term, I likely learned more about what has become useful in my life and ministry from her than from Bruce. Now, today, we are going to be talking about theology. We're also going to be talking about practical theology. So the story ends, though, that Dr. Ryan and Dr. McCormick allowed me to write a paper around the doctrine of election and addiction and the ways in which those two intersect. And it's our hope today that some of the theory and the theology that we have been working with might come forward, but also that there might be some wisdom and there might be some practical ways in which the work that Andy and I have been doing together might honor you. So let's start with a word of prayer. God, as we wait for your Pentecost to fall anew upon us, we pray for your Spirit to be here. We wait for your action, and we respond to your grace. Open our eyes and our ears so that our hands might be strengthened to be your servants and your children in this your world. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. All right, Andy's going to start us off, and then I'll come back.
All right, well, thank you. It's great to be here. Blair, thanks for eating up most of our time there. I appreciate that. That was great. So here, this is the way I want us to jump in this morning is just about every room that I'm in, there is the sense that the church is in crisis mode. And the title of our book seems to present that the church is in crisis mode. But I think in the midst of crisis, there's a sense that we get a little confused. Every time we're in crisis, we lose track of maybe where we should be. And I think we've got this crisis a bit wrong. And one of the things that happens, I think, ecclesiologically in the midst of this crisis is one of the problems is the church tends to think inside this crisis that it's the star of its own story. And part of the reason for that is because there's this assertion that if your congregation is going to survive, it has to find its story. That inside a shrinking religious marketplace, you better find your story or you will die quickly. But I think this is a big theological problem. I think we could say theologically that the church really has no story, that the church surely is not the star of whatever story that it seeks for, and that the star really is God and God's action. And the second supporting actor in this story is actually the world, God's ministry to the world. that the church is never the star of this story, but the church gets to narrate the story. The church gets to witness to this story. But I think in the midst of this crisis, it's very easy for us to think that the church is the star of the story. Now, there's huge ramifications for this because I know no other real cultural collectives that can exist without being the star of their own story. I mean, surely no company or business can exist without being the star of its own story. I shouldn't admit this, but I am a huge fan of Shark Tank. It even sometimes makes me cry, which then I do a cheer for capitalism. But I do like it. I find it very entertaining. But if you watched Shark Tank, and not only is its great accomplishment is making billionaires warm and cuddly, but it's also a huge accomplishment is making us all feel like we're entrepreneurs and that we can find this great breakthrough. But if you watch it, there's some certain themes that come up, and one of the themes that often comes up that the sharks will say is that's a great product, but that's not a business. So there's always some sense that you have to have a business here, not just a great product. And the other dynamic, even when they do decide to invest in a product, they always ask the person to tell the story. Like, how did you come up with this? Who are you? They ask for a narrative to be told about this. Now, maybe they just do that because this is a TV show and you need to have a story. But I do think there's also a sense that you need a story to mobilize your company. If you're ever going to be a company, you have to have a story where, again, you are the star of it. And we think of these biopics that have happened, these kind of company biopics, like there's been millions of them on Apple, and there's even one on Apple that is about the creation of the iPod that I watched on an airplane. And when you watch these, it becomes very clear that it's actually not about the product at all. It's about the personalities and the people behind it. That documentary on a product would be incredibly boring. So we get all these biopics about the craziness of Steve Jobs and the aloofness of Woz. Or there's even one that just recently came out that in Blair's country, the CBC put out about the BlackBerry, which is actually the most Canadian movie I've ever seen because it's all about how the BlackBerry dominated the market. And it starts with something like, they tell us the story that 89% of all cell phone market was the BlackBerry. And then the movie ends with saying today, BlackBerry has 0% of the cell phone market. So it's just a perfect Canadian movie that, they just cannot live in the glory of something. It's just the self-deprecation is just beautiful. So if you, at the end of this, Blair will feel best if you insult him and tell him that he did 0% of a good job. He'll feel very good about that. But even that movie ends up not being about the product. I mean, it really is about how the BlackBerry had dominance and lost it, but it ends up being about the people. It ends up being a story about the people. And my point on this is when we think that the church has to be the star of its own story, then what ends up happening ultimately is God becomes our product. And the best a product can do to have a story, it always becomes about the people, about the personalities. And the best a product can do to have a story is its user guide. And if you're a weird person who reads user guides for fun, I definitely don't want to meet you. You seem like a very, very strange person. But a user guide is no story at all. It's a narrative list, list of instructions. But I think this becomes part of the problem when we get this crisis wrong and we think the church is the star of its own story. Then God becomes the product the church sells, and we all, in one way or another, become kind of prosperity gospel people. I know we like to throw shade on the prosperity gospel, but if we're not careful, our own ecclesiologies can fall into this, and then God becomes the product that we're selling. But what mobilizes us in a narrative base ends up being the difference the church can make, the church's own story, how the church is breaking through in some way. Blair and I think that this is really the wrong crisis, and that there is a crisis. We're not naive, and we think institutional structures within the church are in trouble and are in a difficult time, but we're not so sure that the crisis really ultimately is a crisis of lost relevance and lost resources. That may be there in a bit, but we think that could be a red herring. But we do think there's a crisis, and we think that the crisis actually is God's action, that God's action is a crisis, or the commitment that God is God and therefore God is uncontrollable is a crisis. That in itself is a crisis, but it may be a generative crisis to lean into. Now, there's an interesting dynamic here. I think in the biblical text, there's a sense that when Israel loses a sense of God's act, when Israel kind of gets pulled in to idolatry, it loses this sense that God is the actor. And it thinks, and it often moves into, when Israel moves into idolatry, what ends up happening is our own action becomes really, really significant. So particularly think of First and Second Kings, where the movement in the divided kingdom into the Baals and into fertility worship leads Israel to have to work really hard, to do more, to continue to sweat, to continue to worship these idols. So there's a certain sense that if you get the crisis wrong, what happens when you are moved towards idols is that busyness becomes a certain dynamic of our own human action. And I think we see this in American Protestantism, where the kind of moral horizon of our own lives is busyness. I don't know if this is true with you, it's true with me. Anyone asks how I'm doing, I sigh deeply and say, I'm good, but I'm really busy, which is both to communicate I'm borderline exhausted, and also I got a lot going on. I'm very important. I couldn't be with you in the room today because I am so busy. And there's a certain kind of moral horizon that you're living a good life when you're busy. And I think this happens with the church too. When we lose the crisis or we're misguided in the crisis, then the busy church is the best church. The more you can do, the more that's going on, the better it is. If you're busy, it shows that you are the star of your own story. Busy people, celebrities, others who are stars are always out doing things. They're busy. They have a lot going on. But we think this is a potential real problem. And leaning into this a bit, the Jewish Frankfurt School theorist Erich Fromm wrote this really beautiful little book in the middle of the 20th century called To Have or To Be. And in that book is a section that's probably like 4 or 5 pages. And it's under a heading called Activity and Passivity. And Fromm does this really fascinating thing where he looks at action, like how we think about action inside of modernity. And he makes this assertion that when we think about action often inside of modernity, that we think about action as the expenditure of energy. And he does this very quick gloss that we don't have time to go into too much here, but this kind of gloss where he thinks one of the ramifications of the Reformation and the Reformation kind of equalizing all action. So it kind of eliminates the hierarchy of a praying class, a killing class, i.e. the knights, and a working class, but puts us all as priests, all the priesthood of all believers, before God. Then all of our actions become equal. Of course, those are a high bar at the Reformation. We all have to act as priests. But Fromm's point is as modernity unfolds, that bar gets lower, and now all action is equal. We have no way of really evaluating what action is better, what action has really more value. For the most part, all action is kind of equal. And the only thing that then leads us to be able to define good action next to bad action is the action that expends the most energy is the best action. So whoever is expending the most energy is doing the best. Charles Taylor does something similar. Here's a quote from Fromm. He says, in the modern sense, activity means a quality of behavior that brings about a visible effect of the expenditure of energy. And as I was saying, Charles Taylor does something similar where he talks about the Reformation makes this transition from what you do to how you do it. So it doesn't matter necessarily what you do, it's how you do it. Do you do it passionately? Do you do it with your heart turned towards God? But again, Fromm's point is, once this becomes more secularized, if you will, it becomes a quite vacuous space. And the only thing that qualifies for good action is the action that expends the most energy. And now you can start to see how busyness itself becomes ennoblized. If you're busy, you're expending the most energy, and therefore your action has some kind of value. Now, I'll just admit this here. Blair talked about confessions. This is pretty much how every fight with my wife goes, and maybe this is true with your partner too, is that it always is an evaluation of who's expended the most energy. Like, there's the dishwasher, it needs to be unloaded, and we look at each other, and then we start rehearsing how much energy we've expended today. Well, why should I have to unload the dishwasher? I mean, I had to pick up the kids, or I had to mow the lawn, or I've had a really busy day. I had 8 meetings, and on we go. I'll give you another little secret. I'm sure this is not true at Princeton Seminary with the Princeton faculty, but with my faculty, it's very true that all our evaluation is around the expenditure of energy. You get elected to a committee and you're like, why do I have to be on this committee? What about this guy? He hasn't done anything in 10 years. I'm on a podcast and I have this to do and that to do, that the only real evaluative measure we have is who's expending the most amount of energy. So the best winning action expends the most amount of energy. So this is one of my concerns, again, when we make the church the star of its own story, then you have to expend more and more energy to win this market share. And in many ways, a consultant tries to help you think about how to expend this energy, how to get more energy out of folks. So I think this all happens because we have the crisis wrong. And it leads us to forget, I think, that God is God. So what kind of action is demanded if we want to keep God as God? I think it's a very different form of action. And Blair and I think of this sense of the action that we need is a waiting action. That waiting becomes the form of action, which in itself is inherently paradoxical, maybe even dialectical. That waiting becomes a form of action that makes us attuned to the star of the right story, and makes us, I think, moves us into a direction that gets the crisis correctly. So Blair and I make this argument in the book that we think that the church really starts, the first command that starts the church is, if we see Luke, Acts together, as we should, that we love to think that the church starts in Acts 2. And we're particularly love in the Pentecost story the part of it where it says, and thousands were added to their number. I mean, that's just such a delicious piece of information for late modern people with crisis of decline. We just love that. We should have t-shirts made with thousands were added to their number. But we're not sure that the church really starts in Acts 2. We make this pitch that really the church starts in Acts 1, and it starts with the men on the road to Emmaus and this moment of deep sorrow that all of their expectations have fallen apart. And then they encounter the living Christ. And the first command that starts the church is to go to Jerusalem and to wait. The command to wait is really the command that gathers these people, that gathers the people that the Spirit will fall upon. And we think that there's something really informative for us on that to return to the right crisis, the crisis that God is God, is to become people who gather and wait upon God. Now, saying that the answer to this is to wait is probably everyone in the room hates that. I mean, we absolutely hate the idea of waiting, because in many ways we've been formed as late capitalist moderns to think that waiting is wasting. I mean, we've all watched too many episodes of Shark Tank to not think that waiting is wasting. And modernity really does have this pursuit. The whole modern project is to kind of take all the wanting out of waiting. So you want to eliminate waiting so that what you want you can get nearly immediately. Zygmunt Bauman makes this point, that taking the waiting out of wanting becomes a major objective of the modern project. So in a certain sense, then we're all Homer Simpson. We all are just want things to happen very quickly. One of my first memories of watching The Simpsons was Homer sitting at the microwave and asking Marge when dinner was going to be ready. And she said, in 30 seconds. And Homer said, oh, why do I have to wait so long? We're all, in some sense, formed in that way. And of course, we think of our great cultural breakthroughs. I mean, it's coming soon. Amazon drones to drop off what you want without having to wait for it. And it seems like in the modern project, the only kind of waiting that's allowed is a kind of anticipatory waiting to release this action of having as opposed to being. So the only kind of waiting that we kind of allow for is a Black Friday kind of waiting, where you have to wait for it, and then just rush off and buy cheap TVs or something like that. But we think this is the waiting that is called for in Acts 1 is a very different kind of waiting. And it gets the crisis right, I think, again, that the crisis is that God is God, and that it moves us away from this wrong crisis of thinking that the crisis is the loss of resources and relevance, but that the crisis really is, and maybe what should keep pastors up at night, is how do we speak of a God who is God, a God who is uncontrollable. So if God is God and we want to lean into this, then waiting becomes the way forward. And we think that this is very formative. The classic text of Psalm 46, be still and know I am God. I just learned recently from a Hebrew expert that one of the ways you could render that text, be still and know I am God, is in the Hebrew, you could interpret it as put down your hands and know that I am God, which seems really a profound word for us late modern people. Put down your hands and wait and know that God is God. Put down your hands and stop fighting God, but put down your hands and stop trying to do so much and just wait on God. Trust that God will act. So waiting for God, who is God, becomes its own kind of form of action. And Blair and I are really leaning on the early 20th century pastor, Christoph Blumhardt, who impacted Karl Barth a great deal with this little book called Hastened Waiting, that there's a kind of dialectic at play here. To tend to a God who is God calls for a kind of waiting that is an action. So waiting then becomes an attentiveness. There you wait with a vision of what's to come. Waiting is a school. It forms you in that you wait with a story. I had an experience at an Apple store a few months ago where I had to get my watch updated, and I had to sit there in the store while the software updated, and it was a very busy Sunday, and so the bandwidth was eaten up. And it was the worst waiting experience I've ever had, looking just at the bar of 4%, 8%, 12%. There was no story to inhabit. There's no vision there. There was no sense that this was a kind of hastened waiting. It was a waiting that was utterly lifeless. But some of us have also had experiences of sitting in a cathedral, say like the Chartres Cathedral in France, and waiting there. And it becomes a very different experience that you're waiting with a vision. You're waiting inside a story that surrounds you. So there also is a sense that waiting is resistance. I mean, the civil rights movement is a kind of waiting resistance. And waiting is ultimately joining others in suffering and giving consolation and laughing. Waiting is living in some ways as the psalmist. Maybe at its core, waiting is an act of pilgrimage. I mean, historically, pilgrimage is an active moving, but it's really a waiting on God. It's a moving towards God as you wait. The 14th century mystic and chancellor of the University of Paris, Jean Gerson, wrote a lot about pilgrimage. And he said one of the things that the pilgrim does is the pilgrim always lives ad diem. And he meant to God, that you always are on a pilgrimage to God. But one of the other fascinating things about that is that ad diem in the 14th century was also an idiom for goodbye. So the pilgrim has to say goodbye to something. That the pilgrim has to embrace and walk into the crisis of saying goodbye, believing that they'll meet God in all of their great goodbyes. A few years ago now, in the summer of 2022, my wife Cara decided she wanted to do a pilgrimage, that she wanted to do a walk, and we decided to do it as a family. So we decided to walk the St. Cuthbert's Way, which starts in Melrose, Scotland, and you walk it all the way to the holy island of Lindisfarne in Northumbria. So we had our two kids, and when we planned this, they were early high school, middle schoolers. But after 2 years of a pandemic and not being able to do this, and it got pushed forward into 2022, we all of a sudden had a rising senior and a rising ninth grader. And it became, for both Cara and I, now in the mid-careers, now both in our mid-careers, her as a pastor and me as a professor, it was an experience of walking 63 miles ad diem to God, but also saying goodbye. In some sense, saying goodbye to our kids, allowing them, letting go of them and letting them walk their own path. But it also was a kind of ad diem, saying goodbye to some kind of illusion that we got as youth group kids that we could somehow save the church. As so many people patted us on the back and said, "You're going to make a difference. You're going to save the church," which totally gets the crisis wrong. So it was a real walk of saying goodbye. Well, when you get to the end of this pilgrimage, the last 4 miles, you walk over the mudflats into the Holy Island. And obviously you can only go across this when the tide is out. And so you walk those mudflats, get to the beach, and then walk about 300 yards to the old abbey. And so we were on that last walk after 60 miles of walking. Now you can also visit the Holy Island. There's a causeway that is covered by water, but if you go at the right time, you can just drive over, and there is really good ice cream on the island, so it becomes a tourist trap to go over there. So we walk this after 6 days of walking with our kids, this process of saying goodbye. We get across the 4 miles. We embrace that we did it. And then we walked up to the road that would lead us to the last 300 yards to the Abbey, and we would finish this walk. And that's when I had my Martin Luther experience. As many of you know, in 1515, Martin Luther did a pilgrimage from northern Germany to Rome. And when he got into Rome, he hated everything about Rome. And he hated everyone there. And it was his first sign that there was something very wrong with Christendom and something very wrong with the Holy See. And I hate to admit it, but I had my Martin Luther experience. As we got up onto this road to go to the Abbey, all the tourists were coming onto the same road, and I had just walked 63 miles, and they had walked 63 steps, and I hated every one of those people. I wanted them to get away from me so that I could finish my holy pilgrimage. And not a great way to end this great walk. But we got to the Abbey, we took a family picture, and then we went to our rooms. And there's only like 30 rooms on the island. And we went and we got into our rooms, showered, and then came back out a few hours later, right around 5 o'clock. And the whole island was transformed. All the tourists were gone. They had to get back over on the other side, or they would be stuck there for the night. And now there are only probably 60 people on the island, and it started to speak, and you could feel its reverberating holiness. And we decided to go over and do evening prayer. And so we went to this Anglican church, this little church next to the Abbey, which some of the stones on that church have been on top of each other since 635. And we did evening prayer with some people who lived on the island, who were in the fishing industry, and other pilgrims, and it was an incredible, moving experience. At the end of it, we walked the perimeter of this old little church, and we saw this picture at the back of the church. It's obviously you can see it's just a framed picture with a list, and it'll be very hard for you to see it there. But what this is every prior, bishop, or vicar who has overseen this little church since 635, starting with Aidan, all the way down, and you won't be able to see this, it's too blurry, with Sarah Hillis, who became the vicar of the church in 2018. From 635 to 2018. The church has a very long history. And we had to say goodbye to the fact that we thought we could parent the church, not the church parent us. The other remarkable thing about this picture, if you look on the far left column, the middle left column, you won't be able to see this again, it's too blurry, but there's about a 300-year period where there is no prior, there is no bishop, there is no vicar. About 300 years, which is a long time. And that 300 years, why there's no one there, is because there's no one on the island. That they had gotten some intel that some very weird ships from the North Sea were coming down the island, and some very frightening people, Viking raiders, were coming. So they grabbed Cuthbert's bones, and they grabbed their holy chalice, and they left, and were gone for 300 years. To me, that's very informative. Both the long tail of the church's history and that 300-year period. It is very true that we are in a crisis right now, but I also want to say at least we don't have Viking raiders. At least there aren't Viking raiders that we're facing, and that the church has a very long history, and God has been faithful for a very, very long time within it. All right, so I'm going to turn this over to Blair, and here you go, Blair.
Great. I thought I was sharing, but I am not. So Andy has laid out the false crisis. The real crisis is this one of God. Part of my responsibility is to try to help us to see how these two things shape our imagination in very practical ways, and they limit us. So one of the problems is if you think that the crisis is this, but it's actually this, and you're only focused on this, you're going to miss this. And you need to have a different set of language and a different set of ways of viewing the world and imagination to be able to shift from this to there. And that, I think, is ultimately the role that leaders within the church are going to have to play, is that we are going to have to reimagine alongside leading other people to reimagine something that we might not be able to know what it is. And so we are placed in this sort of shipwrecked Malta situation, not just by external things, but by the very act of God needing to have our own imagination shaped to be able to see what God is doing. So I want to start by just talking about some very practical things that you know, right? Our imagination tells us this story of decline. So just to let you know that the PCUSA, since its inception, has never posted a year of growth as a denomination. Not once. Okay? So maybe your congregation's different, sure. That's great. You're all Princeton grads, so I'm sure that it's better than average. But as a denomination, it has never posted growth. Okay? And it's only increasing the percentage of loss, because as that number of people decline, and the same number of people are leaving, do the math, and all of a sudden, and you can see there's this spike. I think we're likely talking about some human sexuality issues at that point, right? So you all know these numbers. That's the line. The PCUSA will have less than 500,000 members by 2040, and that's a drop from 3.1 million. Just to let you know, this might be a little bit hopeful. The church that I serve in Malawi is divided into 3 synods, which are really the size of denominations. There are about 6 million Christians in my synod, or Presbyterians in my synod, and there are 3 synods. All right, so there are more Presbyterians in Malawi than there are in the United States, Canada, and Scotland combined. Okay, so when you think about what the church and what the Presbyterian church looks like, it does not look like y'all. Most of you. Okay, so the long tail of the church, the global reach of the church, we're doing fine. But this is the story that we tell ourselves, right? That there's this decline, right? And so we, in decline, what is the problem? Calls for a solution, which is we need to do something about this. And so what have we done? We've come up with mission statements. All right? And we laugh, but you know that this is true. Mission statements here are stand-ins for all of those things which we are trying to do in order to be able to counteract that decline. Right? Because mission statements are supposed to get us on a map. We're all supposed to be heading into the right direction together. Right? This is actual text from a denominational website. Okay? So this is, what are they supposed to do? They're supposed to align us so that we're moving forward in a common direction. They give us strategic plans and directions. They help us to focus. They're a decision-making criteria. Right? Notice what all of those things are about. They're all about making us the star of the show, right? And how many one-day or multi-day retreats have you gone on, or have you led to get a group of people to come up with a mission statement, right? And what happens? This is often what happens.
You've probably heard that Restoration Fellowship is a community that's intentionally engaged. But what does that really mean?
Our desire is to see communities engaged intentionally, to engage intentional communities, and for intentional communities to be engaged together.
We believe that you cannot truly engage intentionally outside of community, and you cannot be intentional with your community truly unless you're engaged. And you cannot be truly in community unless you are engaged intentionally.
If you're new to our community, our intention is to get you engaged.
If your intention is to engage here, welcome to our community.
If you've been engaging here for a while, thank you for being an intentional member of our community.
All this to say, we've crafted a brand new mission statement to simplify it all for you.
We here at Restoration Fellowship are a community.
Intentionally, doing life together.
Telling engaging and intentional stories.
Within community.
Creating intentionally engaging,
community-centered environments.
And pursuing intentionality.
Within the confines of an engaged,
intentional community.
We strive to build community.
Intentionally.
Through engagement.
Intentionally.
We'll see you on Sunday.
Come on! You know that's true! Sure. Yes. So, you know it's true, right?
If I showed that to my presbytery, they would give them $100,000.
Yes! Right? But remember, that line is still going down. Right? Because there are forces at work in this world that are bigger than a mission statement is going to be able to stop. Right? The crisis is not decline, and the answer is not going to be to do more things. Whatever those things might be, they're not working, and they're not going to work. And this isn't the first time, though, that we've been in this situation, right? Andy talked about being in Acts 1, where the church was called to wait. And like a normal church committee, they got bored. And so they decided, and to be clear, they were faithful, right? So Peter realizes, okay, looks around and says, oh, Judas isn't here. We got 11 people, and we're supposed to have 12 because we know our Bibles, and there's 12 tribes, and we got to have 12 disciples. So let's get an extra. We got a moment. This is, nothing's happening right now. We might as well do something. So let's elect an elder. Okay. And so what do? They pull up these two guys. One who has a very long and confusing name, and the other one is Matthias. And what do? The super democratic process of casting lots. And then Matthias is the new apostle. And of course, all of your churches are named St. Matthias after this Matthias because we know that the church is built on his work. No, come on. We never hear from him again. Not once. Because God had already chosen somebody. And they only had to wait to Acts 9 to find out that guy's name was Saul and was going to become Paul. That the 12th apostle was God's choice, not their choice. Now, to be fair to them, they did not drop dead because they did this bit of administrative anxiety reduction. Right? That can happen in Luke Acts. Right? So there's no explicit condemnation of their action. Right? So we're not trying to blame the church for making mission statements and doing these kind of administrative anxiety reduction strategies. But neither are they commended. And God is as God does. Paul becomes the apostle. And God acted in God's time. So I think often what happens is we have anxiety, and so we do something which only doesn't produce the results that we want, so then we get more anxious and we do more, and it's this spiral. Whereas what we're inviting and asking people to imagine is that waiting might lead to an encounter. And an encounter here would be where you are seen and you see another person. You hear and see another person. You are able to serve them and delight in them as they serve and delight in you. And person here can be human, can be a person, but it can also, in the end, be God. That waiting can lead to this encounter. So one of the strategies, or one of the things proposals that we've got is to move away from things like the mission statement towards something we call the watchword. Andy referenced the Bloomharts. The Bloomharts have it's a great story. You need to know that this book, When Church Stops Working, is also built on Andy's other six of Andy's other books, right? You could set your clock by Andy releasing a book. It's going to happen every year, right? Maybe multiple times a year. But there's 6 other ones. So if you want a story about the Bloomharts and their watchword, it's in Pastor? Church. Crisis of Decline. So another great thing to get. But the watchword is essentially a slogan, or it's often words from Scripture that are taken in a new way up by a community. And so the opening sermon was talking about memory, right? And so a watchword remembers Scripture, that God has spoken in Scripture, and in some ways it has become new and alive again in this new way or context. So the Bloom Hearts was Jesus is Lord. We have an example in the book you can read about where Romans 8 becomes important, and it's for a congregation. Martin Luther King is also one of these other stories, and will make a way where there is no way. And so there are these moments in individuals and corporate lives in which Scripture all of a sudden speaks, and it becomes something that is not just like a mission statement, but is a witness to what God has done in that place for those people. It's like an Ebenezer, I suppose. And it's going to arise from a real encounter with God. And so, as I said, when we see and hear God, that's when we have this encounter. And often, encounters happen in moments of pain, a point of pain. Right? We see who God is on the cross. And without that, we don't have the fullness of the resurrection. And so the idea of place sharing or being with somebody in that moment of pain. In the Bloom Hearts case, there was a woman who was oppressed by demons. And so there was an exorcism. I know we could spend a lot of time talking about this. I'd love to, but we're not going to talk about exorcism today. But in Martin Luther King's case, he was oppressed by white supremacy. And in the case that we tell in the book, it's death itself, the death of a child. And so at these moments, somehow God enters into that and brings a moment of clarity that then propels the community forward in a new witness and in a new way. And so what would that look like? So Andy and I did an experiment, a Lilly-funded experiment, where we took a project from England, and they essentially take a professional photographer and a poet, a recognized poet, and a group of young people, and put them together for a 3 to 5 day experience where the young people take portraits, like camera portraits of each other, and they write a poem about each other. And if you were listening yesterday, if you were at the lunch yesterday, right, like there was great quotes about the power of portraits, right? And if you see that portrait of Dr. Barnes, he's standing in a pulpit, right? And none of the other presidents have they're all just them, right? There he is in a pulpit, and his hand is out, right? And so he's reaching out to the community. He's also like proclaiming the word of God, but he's also open to what is happening. Like there is more going on in that portrait than just a simple picture. It is not a selfie. He's not holding out his hand, taking a picture of himself. Look at me, how important I am. Let me sell myself to you. It is somebody that has seen and heard who he is, and then is reflecting that in a form of art. And that is what this project aims to do, both in poetry and in portraiture. We did it in about 10 different congregations, and I want to highlight 3 things. First of all, it was a real pain to get people to sign up to do these things, because everybody wants to know what am I going to do and what am I going to get out of this? And we're like, well, you're going to meet another person. And they're like, not compelling. Right? Universally, after they did it, they all said, can we do it again next weekend? Right? So their imaginations were shaped that they had to do something and get something out of it. And when they entered into this experience, all of a sudden they realized that there was value and that they could see that there was something else other than what they had imagined going in. The second thing is just that, this actually changes and shapes the way that they feel about themselves. We used a measurement, a standard sort of mental health measurement on the front end, and we supplemented it with some questions around spirituality and faith, and then the same measurement at the back end. And in almost every case, all factors of mental health and spiritual health increased between those two experiences. Now, we're not saying that there's a long-term, but between this 3-day, there was a significant enough improvement to see that in these people. Why? Because they were lonely. Because they wanted to see and encounter somebody else. This is right after COVID. One woman said, "This is the first time I've seen somebody face to face in a year." She was desperate to connect with somebody else, right? Her mental health went from this to this, right? Third thing is, our second phase of the experiment was we did this in the same congregation 6 times. Kind of see, hey, what happens if we get a whole bunch of people doing this? And, it's not world-changing, but one story is kind of interesting. They had their session. I don't know, I'm Presbyterian, so I call it a session. It wasn't a Presbyterian congregation, and so the elders are gathered, and one of the elders is a digital marketing guy, and they had said, post-COVID world, if we don't have a great website, nobody's going to come to our church. We all need an amazing website. We need a great mission statement, right? We need a great website, because that's where everybody's going to come through to come to our church. And so this guy said, hey, I know what to do. This is my job. I sell things all the time. I can sell God, no problem, right? He didn't say that out loud, right? But that's the logic of what's going on, right? And so he's making his presentation to the other elders, saying, this is what I think we should do, da, 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 da. And one of the elders said, oh, this is really interesting. We keep using the word community, but I don't really feel like we're actually inviting people into this community. I feel like we're kind of like selling ourselves. What are we actually inviting people into? And so then they went on and had a whole conversation using some of the same language that we had practiced in our experiment to talk about what it was to be a community, what it was to talk about brothers and sisters. I don't know about your family, but my family doesn't have a website. And if you kind of showed up at my house and said, hey, I saw your website, it's awesome, I'd like to join you, that would be weird. But I will invite you to my house. I'll have you come and sit at my table because you're my brothers and sisters. There's a world of difference between those two things. And they still have a website, right? It didn't mean that they junked that. But as a community, they have started to think about themselves in different ways that allows for encounter and allows for waiting for those encounters to happen. I'm going to end with this. I know Dale's. I know that for a bunch of us, waiting sounds very passive, and we like to be active. In fact, some of us like to be activists, right? That there is a sense in which justice and mercy need to become real and present in the world. And that this may be viewed as a kind of quietism, a retreat from action. This is a picture from Grace Presbyterian Church in Calgary, Alberta. And the minister there is actually one of the few PTS grads who's serving in Canada. His name is Jake Van Pernis. And some of you might know him. you need to know a little bit about Canadian history. We do not have that peculiar, pernicious institution of slavery as part of our history, but we do have a history of horrible relationships with First Nations people. You might call it American Indians. The churches, mainly the mainline churches, so the Presbyterian Church included, the United Church, the Anglican Church, and the Roman Catholic Church, we operated residential schools in cooperation with the government. So the government provided funding, and we operated the schools, which then took children from their families and placed them into these schools to beat the Indian out of them, so that they could become good white model citizens, right? We've had to reckon with that as a church, as a country. I was part of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission where, as an official for the Presbyterian Church in Canada, I had to make a confession of grief. And while other people, First Nations people, could say whatever they wanted to me and tell me about their pain, right? So on an individual level, it's been very profound. But the residential schools it continues to be an issue. And a number of years ago, there were some ground sonar findings that there were likely about 215 unmarked graves at one of these residential schools, likely of children who went to school but never came back. And of course, there's anger at this. And so what you see here is a demonstration of that anger, in which a number of churches that had run those, this is the big steeple church in Calgary, Alberta, which is central to where a lot of this was going on, had red paint splashed on the door. And it happened across the West. And so Jake gets this phone call, of course, and he has to make a decision of what am I going to do, right? And when I pose this what am I going to do to people, many people will say, well, of course you're going to wash the paint off because it's vandalism, right? And we've got programs for that. We've started to do the things that we need to do in order to make this right. And they need to get with the program and not vandalize our buildings on a main street in Calgary. And it's shameful, but many churches did do that. They just washed it off. There's nothing. But Jake said, I'm not going to do that. And maybe it's because he's American and because he's been aware of reparations and reconciliation and these sort of things. But this is there's steps. You can't see it in this picture, but this is the steps up to the church. And so Jake just set up a chair on the steps, and he waited. And he waited a long time. And people started asking him, what's going on? And why aren't you cleaning this up? And eventually the people who did this came forward to the steps. And so it's this door, right? It's like this liminal space between the sanctuary, which is right behind those doors, and the world. And Jake set up on that stoop to wait and to listen for the pain and the problems and the injustice that was coming at him. He didn't try to scrape it clean. He waited and listened and then had real encounters. The congregation spent a couple of years trying to work through some of these things, and it was like, as Dr. Barnes said yesterday, community ain't easy. His session was not happy about some things. And did they get it perfect? No. Again, like Dr. Barnes, there were mistakes that were made on his watch. But that congregation was able to wait into a movement of God. And I wish that I had a picture. I've been corresponding with Jake and trying to get a better picture, because at the end of the day, a number of years later, what they had decided to do was they commissioned a First Nation artist to turn this into a mural. So it is now a permanent part of their congregation. Because he waited. And then because God has acted in the world. I think that there are going to be practical ways. When the church stops working, maybe we should stop working too, and wait and allow God to be God. Thanks.
We don't have time for questions, unfortunately. In less than 15 minutes, we're going to start the next session. So if you want to make a bathroom run, stretch your legs, and then we'll be starting again here at 9:45. Thank you.